We're here today with Dr. Muchagamba, who led the charge in the investigation for the disaster at Bhopal. Thank you for being with us here today, Dr. Muchagamba.
Absolutely, Ron. Thanks for having me on. You know, I could talk your ear off about everything that was wrong with Bhopal, but I'll kind of just give you the meat and potatoes here really quickly. Basically, the way this disaster was able to happen was the fact that they neglected to have their fail-safes up and running. You know, with a plant working with that large of a volume of really awful chemicals, you know, fail-safes were needed, and those fail-safes at that time were not running properly.
Why weren't these operational fail-safes running at the time of the disaster?
Well, there's multiple reasons, and the three main fail-safes that would have eliminated this disaster from happening was the vent gas scrubber, the flare system, and then the Freon cooler for the MIC tanks. The vent gas scrubber was out of commission at the time and had been turned off by upper management about a month earlier. They just didn't feel like it needed to be on anymore. The flare system had been out of commission for a while due to maintenance issues with a corroded pipe, so that was being taken care of. And then the Freon cooler for the MIC tanks was turned off due to the financial state of the plant. Upper management felt that the amount of capital they were wasting on the Freon for something that they didn't foresee happening.
So with a lot of the fail-safes not working at the plant, how did this change the day-to-day operations?
It really didn't, and that's kind of the, you know, what led to this becoming the disaster that it was. One of the major errors that happened that day, you know, about how they were doing routine maintenance on some of the pipes that were around the MIC tanks and everything, well, they cleaned them with water. Usually what happens, and when they have to do this kind of maintenance on the plant, is they put a slip line in to block the water from ever breaching any parts of the pipe network that it could get in contact with the MIC tanks. The reason this, like I talked about earlier with the plant being in financial trouble, was that they had to take a lot of shortcuts. So this was normally just a 2-hour safety precaution that it took to be able to put this slip line in. And over the past couple months, it had been neglected to the point where it wasn't even something that they did anymore.
I'm going to guess that this is the chemical that created the hazards and the event. Can you tell us what exactly MIC is and what others, if any, what other chemical hazards were on site?
Absolutely. MIC was the main feedstock used to produce, you know, the pesticide that they were looking for. MIC is methyl isocyanate, and
I don't know what that is.
It's an organic compound that the reason that they chose MIC and that chemical to produce 7, their pesticide, was because its organic structure allowed for cleaner chemistry, so to say, so less waste, higher yields, better product. You know, so that would lead people to think
it kind of helped with their financial situation, like you talked about earlier.
It should have, in theory, yes, but when reacted with water, when it comes to contact with water, it violently reacts and it gives off, you know, exothermic heat and energy, and it basically allows all the other MIC molecules around it to then react faster, react with more energy, so it, you know, leads to a runaway reaction. And with dangerous chemicals on site, yes, they kept you know, large quantities of phosgene, but they knew how dangerous phosgene was and were able to take precautions, you know, to actually take care of what they had on site.
So what could have been done differently at the plant in Bhopal in order to minimize, you know, the amount of phosgene and MIC they had on location that created this disaster?
But what they could have done with the MIC was not hold 80 tons of, you know, of MIC on site, which, you know, that was the catalytic reason for, you know, the entire disaster happening in the first place.
All right. Well, thank you for being here with us today, Dr. Muchagamba, and see you next time.
Thank you very much, Ron. Had a great time.
I'm here now with an anonymous former Union Carbide employee who now works for Dow Chemical, who has agreed to answer a few questions for us over the disaster that happened in Bhopal. So, first question, what did happen that night in Bhopal at the plant? What caused the disaster?
So after a series of investigation, it showed that a large amount of water was introduced into the MIC tank. This caused a chemical reaction that forced the pressure release valve to open and allowed the gas to escape. In my opinion, I think the operators were not doing their job properly.
Okay, so kind of sounds like you think the operators were at fault for this disaster. So why do you think that?
They've been complaining about poor working condition, and secondly, it is very suspicious that none of them were hurt. And also, it showed that only an employee with the skills and knowledge of the plant will have been able to cause such a disaster. Yeah, basically that's what I think.
So you said that the operators were always complaining about their working conditions. Do you think there's anything that Union Carbide could have done in order to make them happier that might have prevented this disaster?
Well, I think they were well compensated for the job they did for the company. It's very rare to see an employee who's over satisfied. They always complain about one thing or the other. So I think they were well compensated for the job they did for the company.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time. After a commercial break, we'll be back with an operator to see how they feel about these accusations. We're now here with one of the operators that was present at the night of the disaster. Can you tell us what happened that night?
The pressure gauges started to increase at first with the normal fluctuations and then later above the safety limits. At that point, we went to an emergency procedure.
The company seems to believe that the operators are at fault for this disaster. Do you feel like they adequately prepared you for this?
Union Carbide didn't train us enough, and the operators with better training left for another jobs. All the equipment to contain the MIC release were not sufficient.
During the disaster, about how much MIC was released?
Around 42 millions of MIC was released.
So with 42 tons of MIC being released, about how big was the vapor cloud that covered Bhopal?
An area of about approximately 15 kilometers was affected, and approximately 3.3 kilometers having a ppm above 8. And another 12 kilometers have a ppm around or above 1.
So what kind of concentrations are above safety limits?
Immediate danger to life and health is 3 ppm, and the time weighted average is 0.02 ppm. Individuals exposed to vapors above 21 ppm experience severe iterations to the nozzle throat.
Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the Bhopal interviews. We're now here with environmentalist Chris Garza. So Chris, what can you tell me about the environmental background of the Bhopal plant site?
Thanks for having me, Ron. Well, the area around the plant was used for a dumping ground for hazardous chemicals, and by 1982, water wells in the vicinity of the Union Carbide factory had to be abandoned. Solar evaporation ponds that were used as the dumping. There was 3 ponds, 2 of them were for normal operations and 1 was an emergency operation. The ponds were lined with a polyethylene liner to make sure that there was no leaching into the groundwater.
Which occurred.
Well, there's 2 sides of it. The first side are done by various groups like Greenpeace, and there's also studies done by the NEERI. The NEERI was sponsored by Union Carbide, so their results are a little bit conflicting with other studies that were done. One study found that there is hazardous contaminants for the drinking water, and the drinking water wasn't usable. However, the NEERI found that the water was perfectly drinkable. The soil around the plant was not contaminated. There wasn't very many heavy metals, and crop yields around the site had not changed. Beginning in 1999, Greenpeace and others did a study on well water, groundwater, soil, vegetables around the area of the Union Carbide factory. And they found some contaminants of heavy metals and other chemicals like hexachlorobutadiene, hexachloromethane, naphthalene, mercury, lead, 7, and some other pesticides. Right? So one sample showed mercury levels 20,000 times higher than expected. Cancerous chemical trichloroethylene was found, and that chemical is the chemical that impairs the fetal development. The BBC took a water sample. The sample was then tested in the UK and it was found to have 1,000 times the World Health Organization recommended maximum amount of carbon tetrachloride. And that is another cancerous toxin that was found nearby. The Center for Science and Environment, a Delhi-based pollution monitoring lab, released test results showing pesticide groundwater contamination up to 3 kilometers away from the factory.
So it sounds like there's a lot of pollution that happened because of this event. But was there anything good that came out of it?
Yeah, definitely. There were some legal benefits that came into play. After the events had happened, environmental awareness and activism in India increased significantly. The Environmental Protection Act was passed in 1986. This was to create a Ministry of Environment and Forest, and this strengthened India's commitment to the environment.
So did any of this pollution get cleaned up? Who did that?
Union Carbide was not found to be responsible to do the cleanup. Instead, it was actually the Union Carbide Indian portion that did the cleanup. Once they got full control of the company when Union Carbide split, then they were able to start doing the cleanup, and this was continued until after 1994, and they ended the cleanup on the site in 1998.
So how much did it cost to clean all that up?
So it cost around $2 million, but that wasn't to clean up the entire site. The site is still there, still standing. To completely clean up everything, a government estimate was done, and it was found that it would take about $10 million to clean up everything. So the plant still remains there, and there's still a little bit of the chemicals that remain at the site.
Well, thanks for coming on the show today, Chris.
Thanks, Ron.
We're now here with a survivor from the Bhopal disaster. Hassan, can you tell us what life has been like in Bhopal after the disaster?
Yeah, it's been painful and frustrating.
What do you think can be done to help these people, these families, in order to solve these problems that they have?
Well, first and foremost, you need to take a good look at what the government, the central government and the local government of Madhya Pradesh is doing for the affectees. It's easy to make political promises and then not follow up on them. First and foremost, we need to change the official count of the casualty numbers and the injury numbers, revise them so they have a much more accurate depiction of the events. Secondly, we need to be allowed to pursue the matter in US courts, because Dow is, after all, a US company, and they should be held liable for the mistakes of UCC if they have taken on the assets of UCC.
Distributed. Who do you think's to blame for the disaster and for the slow settlement?
Well, the common consensus is that UCC, UCIL, and Dow are to blame for the disaster with the inadequate safety measures and then the follow-up. But a large part of the blame, I think, lies with the Indian government, both central and the local government of Madhya Pradesh.
Well, thank you for coming on the show today, Hassan. It's been a pleasure having you. And that concludes the Bhopal interviews.